or in a conservative society, or in fascism. There is no problem with that. Brazil is as capitalist as the US is. Well, they're kind of the same in that. Brazil is as capitalist as France is, let's say. But of the capitalist ideologies, liberalism is the most common, at least in the West. Now, all ideologies have some level of inconsistency, but liberalism is a bit better than the last ideology we saw. Conservatives have a certain taste for hypocrisy that other ideologies don't share with them, or not as much at least. Liberalism has many contradictions, but they, in general, liberal theorists, make an effort to be consistent. So it's easier to talk about it, yet there are still difficulties. What we're doing as political scientists is still hard because, first of all, as I said, it's old. And over the 400 years, roughly, that modern liberalism existed. You can go back further than that, but it's not that relevant to our current discussion. You could go back to Greek times, but whatever. Modern liberalism is 400 years old, roughly, and many things happened over that time. And they're different, these traditions. So we have a lot to delve into. And one big obstacle in simply talking about it or teaching about it on this side of the world is that your mind is poisoned by the Americans. And the Americans use this word in a very specific way. It's not wrong the way they use the word. It's just when the Americans say the word liberal, they mean the left wing of liberalism. So liberalism is a spectrum, like any ideology, right? And there's a left, which is social liberalism. When the Americans use the word liberal, they mean the absolute left corner, like the end of the liberal spectrum. That's what they talk about when they talk about. They don't talk about classic liberalism or about neoliberalism. They talk about social liberalism, where they use the word liberal. They would say something like Obama is a liberal, which is true, but he's not representative of what liberalism is globally, right? So the Americans have their own variant of liberal. And well, we just have to deal with that. But it's important that you understand that this word and that this ideology changed over times and can mean different things in different times. And I'm not going to talk today about social liberalism. That's for another time. So that's not what I mean with the word. When I use it, I don't use it in the American way. I use it in the European way, or the South American way that the word is used. I think Bolsonaro even came from the Liberal Party originally. I think that is his party. So that doesn't always mean the left. Okay, so let's get into that. Let's get into this idea of liberalism changing over time, right? I put too much time in making a clumsy graphic to show you this. So we're going to spend the next hour talking about my pretty little graphic. No. I think when I was reading and making notes for this class, I noticed that there's some kind of rhythm in the history of liberalism. And of course, it's a big abstraction. It's an overstatement to put it in a graph, but it helps you understand some things. And I remember Sophia had some question about dialectics last time. Well, I tried to make some kind of dialectic this time, right? So we're going to try to do this. This is amateur dialectics. Have a look at my graph. You can see three horizontal lines. One says right, one says center, and one says left. They show you the political spectrum, but it's kind of on its head. So you have to hold your head like that, and then still they're opposite. Anyway, so you have the right, this is political right end of the spectrum. You have the center, and then the left. The left is closer to the center because we're not using the entire left spectrum. We're only using the edge, the right edge of the left. If you understand what I mean. That's kind of where it ends the story for liberalism. And liberalism kind of moves between this over time. It moves between far right and center to a little bit left. Sometimes it's a friend to socialism. Sometimes it helps socialists with things. And then it's when it's briefly touches upon the left before going back to what it really is, a center-right ideology. So, and well, from left to right, okay, that's confusing to use in this context. But from one edge of the screen to the other, that's time, right? It's the timeline. So, kids, sit back and listen to my story, the history of liberalism. We start with John Locke. I could start with some kind of Greek hedonist philosopher, but that is way too complex. We're going to start with John Locke, the first, I would say, modern liberal. I taught a class about him. I hope you remember a little bit of that, Mariana. Do you? Or nothing at all? Okay, I'm going to assume it was a yes.
Yes.
So anyway, John Locke. John Locke, I would say, is center-right. He's clearly an advocate of the capitalist class, but, well, as long as you're not a slave, he kind of recognizes the equality of people, and he thinks everybody should have rights and things like that. Now, the importance of Locke and people after him, on the immediate aftermath of it, was that they were reacting to the king. They were trying to decrease royal absolutism, the absolute power of the old elites. And that means that this initial liberal tradition, the people after Locke, were revolutionaries to some extent. Liberalism started as a revolutionary theory trying to overthrow the old order, the old, that's called super conservative order, and that pulled it to the left. And this is where socialism kind of gets born out of this. And that goes all the way to the French Revolution, where they support the French Revolution, the first one. They overthrow the king, and the bourgeoisie grabs the power. But then they got out of hand, because then those damn poor people, they wanted more. And then they had another revolution. And then they actually installed democracy, and it all got bad, you know, like people having power and such. And the rich were like, oh no, this is not what we wanted. And then they kind of turned away from the revolutionary politics, because it got too scary. Suddenly, these workers, they had power. And then they killed Robespierre, and they killed the revolutionaries, and then they kind of went back to some kind of monarchy. So then they learned their lesson, right? They were like, oh no, we can't. This is where conservatism is born. This is where conservatism splits off from liberalism. And they start moving back to the right of the spectrum. So this is after the French Revolution. And this is what we would call classic liberalism, right? This period. This is where the big names come in, like Adam Smith, like Jeremy Bentham, like, what the hell? Some kind of drone outside my house. It's weird. Maybe it's from Mauricio, like the pun mayor. Anyway, what was I saying? Bentham, Ricardo, Mill, all these kind of classic names in liberalism come from this era, when its original turn to the right. And it becomes this very bourgeois ideology of the night watch state, where the goal of the state is to have the police, and the police beats up poor people and keeps you safe while there is free trade and you get rich, right? It's the ideology of the industrial class, which gains power both against the workers and against the old elite, the aristocracy. Now, this leads to hyper inequality, predictably. It leads to a society which is very grim and very hostile, where it's obvious that the poor are not happy. And this kind of industrial horror of mass child labor, of malnutrition, of people getting shorter instead of taller over time, that literally happened. This type of society, which was, if you would step outside your mansion, it would be obvious that something was wrong in these times. And this is the time that sociology starts, and you have the first studies of poverty. And worst of all, you have the start of communism, because they're not the only ones who are seeing it. Marx rises in this era and writes his big complaint about all of this situation, right? The Communist Manifesto, Capital, that's all from this era. And the liberals realize that they cannot keep going down this path or they're going to get lynched. There's going to be a new revolution. And the workers, they're not going to side with them. Because they always assumed until then that the workers were on their side. Because they were on their side in the French Revolution. But with this new communist revolution coming, they said, oh no, we need to do something. Because we abolished the king, the guy who could help us. Or we kind of took his power away. And then we have no army of our own. We only have the police. And so we need to do something for these workers, right? These stinky workers, because they're going to make us sick and all of this. So it starts turning to the left again. They start understanding that you cannot have it fully your way, or political forces will be initiated that are dangerous to liberalism. And this turn is what we call social liberalism. It's from this era. The first wave of it, let's say. People like Green, Berlin, the younger Mill, John Stuart Mill, they're from this era. But that gets very boring, right? You're like, well, doing good, helping people, paying taxes. We can't keep doing this, right? We want that money. That's why we started in the first place, to sell slaves and such, like Locke. So they got bored with it and they started moving halfway century, started moving to the right again. And there was again enthusiasm for capitalism. And liberalism came back to the classic liberalism. This is kind of second wave in economic theory of, what do you call this? The marginalist school. This is basically when they think they've beaten Marxism, or they have an answer to Marxism, and they start moving to the right again. But that also goes wrong, because that creates, again, hyper-equality, tensions, and World War II. So then in World War II, like, damn it, we thought we had it, and now we created another enemy. We created fascism of whole countries who now are against us. And communism still exists, and they're all fighting each other and make it stop. And they were panicked. So after World War II, sorry, make it a bit more comical. It's all very serious. But after World War II, it starts turning to the left again, because they thought, damn, these workers, like we need to, like, now they have the right to vote. It keeps getting crazier. So we need to do something for them. And it starts moving again towards social liberalism. But in fact, this is where liberalism almost died. Let's say in the 1950s. There was like 4 liberals left. Because the world was communist, fascist, or socialist at that point. But then 1960s, 1970s, they get bored again of all this welfare. And they think, but you know, there's more money to be made. You know, this meme of this guy who says, life is good, but it could be better, right? That's kind of the mood they're in. So then they turn again to the right. And this is where neoliberalism starts, right? 1970s, 1980s. Then we get the neoliberal era. And that again leads to the present, with our double crisis in the last 10 years, right? The last decade. You had the 2008 financial collapse, and then we have the corona crisis currently. And now again, I think liberalism is in a crisis. I wrote an essay about this, like I wrote an essay about almost everything we talk about. I think it's from 2 months ago, from January. Where I think that, look, I think nowadays there are very few people, and if you're one of them, please correct me, but I think there's almost nobody that thinks that right now the solution to things is that the government does nothing, right? The government's like, vacunas, meh, healthcare, let's just stay home. I think there's almost nobody in the world, well, no, there's some Americans, but outside of that, that thinks that the solution to the problem is the government just letting go. So I think that this core liberal tendency, or at least a neoliberal tendency, I think it's not dead, because liberalism, as you can see, never really dies, but it's in trouble. And there's the question is, what's going to come out of this, right? What's the next step? That's for you to answer. My gamble, it's going to be identity politics. They're going to say, women, lesbians, black people, Mariana, we're going to do nothing for you. But that green hair, though, that's cool. I think that's the next turn they're going to take. It's going to be their turn to the left, but to the ethical left. Can't feed your babies, just kill them. You know, like yeah. I think that's what's happening with liberalism right now, but that's speculation, that's not history. Now, as you can see here, it's quite a bumpy road, right? Liberalism is a bit, is like a political zombie. It keeps falling and it keeps getting up. It keeps falling, it keeps getting up. And that's remarkable. So it's an ideology that falls and gets up a lot over time. And that's, I think this is very important if you would plot this against other ideologies, because it would show you, I think, some interesting things. If you would plot communism against this, for example, right? Let's say the same line of communism. It has the same movement, but you would see then that when we talk about the fall of communism, really, we should call it the first fall of communism. Because liberalism went through this motion 3 times. Of falling up, getting on its face. Communism fell once, and we consider that like the end of it. But liberalism been at that point where there's like 3 people left who believed in it many times. So I think that's interesting perspective from the communist one. Like maybe we just saw the first version of it, and there's many more to come. Because nobody says that capitalism failed because it fell, because it came back, right? Anyway, I think that's interesting comparison to have in mind, that other ideologies, I think, also can make this comeback and come in different iterations. But what does this tell us about liberalism? First of all, it means that this ideology must have some very strong foundations. If there was nothing to this idea, it would not come back after having almost literally destroyed the world in World War II. But it was fascism that destroyed the world, but fascism was born out of this. It would not come back if there was no lasting appeal to it. We're going to talk a bit later about why it appeals. There's many reasons. Part of it is that it's the backing of the elite, and that makes it easy to come back, right? The PRI will forever come back, not because of any merit of its own, but because it represents something that, well, unless you have a total revolution, will not go. But also because its principles, there's some fundamental likability in liberalism, and some, at least, I think one thing that's very likable with liberalism is that it looks or sounds harmless, and I think that makes it very survivable. On the other hand, if it keeps falling and getting up, that includes the falling part. So there must also be some inherent weaknesses to this ideology that lead it to, whenever you actually try to do it, some kind of disaster happens. So there must be something to that, right? There must be some inherent weakness in this too. And if you combine them together, how do you get from one to the other? It's through adaptation. In the dialectic of liberalism, you have inherent tendencies that create problems, that create reactions against it. Now, if we're talking true dialectics, but it also has some kind of adaptive ability. And that must have to do not with liberalism, but with its thinkers, with liberals. Liberals are, compared to conservatives, I think are more critical, are more self-critical, and are brilliant to some extent. There's some very good thinkers in this line of thought, in this ideology, that are able to see what is wrong with their own ideology and that are able to adapt it to new times, to their massive credit. So that's the idea here. Do you understand me so far? Or was this gibberish? Mr. Diego, do you understand it, or
I think it's clear.
Okay. So, but we're going to talk about different phases of this, right? Today I'm talking about, I cannot mark on my slides, I think, or can I? Can I summon? Anyway, we're talking about, let's say, the first way, like in between French Revolution and industrial horror. That's kind of the part that we're talking about. We're talking about classic liberalism and its reincarnations, right? This comes back 3 times. But we're talking about, let's say, this the center right variant of it, not the far right, not the left one either. So then the question is, what binds this together, right? What are the common principles of liberalism, the common values? We discussed this before with communism. I'm going to do a similar thing, and I'm going to talk about some principles. Now, I want to give some caveats before I do this. First of all, this is going to be limited. I'm not going to talk about everything. One big thing I'm not going to talk about is capitalism. I'm going to touch upon it, but I have no slides specifically on explaining capitalism, because I've done that many times before, and I'm going to do it again next time. So we're not getting into that. We're not going to get too deep into the economics of liberalism, although it is really an economical theory. So just so you know, the second point, what was it? What was my second point? I had some things to say about this. I forgot. Another point is that these things are gonna seem a little bit less coherent than they really are, because I'm pulling them apart. But really all these principles are connected, and to some extent they are the same thing. Liberalism is a consistent ideology. It's quite well integrated, but I have to pull it apart slide by slide, principle by principle. But just so you know, they're all connected. And if you see them together, they're a bit more powerful than they are separately. And third, the structure is, I'm going to explain your principle and I'm going to criticize it, with one criticism. Why? Because since liberalism is the default option, it's normality, I think it's important that you understand that it's still a philosophy, that it's still constructed, it's still based on assumptions that are partly wrong, and partly right. But by the same point, I'm also holding back on the criticism. I'm only give you one criticism. I could talk for maybe 5 days about this. Basically, everything I write on my blog is some criticism of liberalism. I'm not liberal, I'll say this on front, but we try to keep it civil and show you the strength. So, okay, what are these principles? Too much introduction, not enough action. First one that I want to talk about is individualism. Individualism is not unique to liberalism, but it's the most typical of it, right? Liberalism, all liberal theory, all of it, assumes or builds its theory around individuals. It assumes that the world exists of self-interested individuals, that you can separate people from their group and still have something left, right? The individual. And that all these individuals try to do what's best for them. And conservatism thinks the same, but conservatism has a negative valuation to this. They think this is how it is, but it's bad, right? We need the community to temper the self-interest of people. Liberals don't think this. They think this is a good thing. They want the world to exist out of self-interest individuals. And they think that the experience of the individual should be the starting point of politics. How do people feel about something? Does it feel good? Is it nice to you? That's kind of the first question they would ask. That's the base moral value. Do people like it, right? Is it enjoyable? So there's some element of hedonism, political hedonism in liberalism. The idea that at the end of the day, life is about pleasure. That in the end of the day, people respond to pleasure and pain. This is from Jeremy Bentham, a guy I particularly don't like, but anyway, Jeremy Bentham has this theory that humans, well, that we're very simple, we're binary. You try to avoid pain and you try to achieve pleasure, and so that should be the measure stick of everything, because that's the base human experience, right? So if something is liked by people, that's the most important metric, and that's what we should make judgments based on. So for example, not that Bentham talked about it, you'd probably be horrified by the idea. Okay, wait, Diego.
Oh yeah, I just have the question. Which people? Like every people or?
It's a good question. Western white people in Bentham's case. Although we'll get to that later. Liberalism in theory wants to be universal. So all people. But the British had some, well, they were colonialists, right? They had some level of racism that was normal, right? But compared to other ideologies at his time, he meant most people, yes.
Okay, thank you.
So within Britain, he means all people. Let's say it like that. So to put this concretely, right? Let's take something like transgender. To most people, including myself, it's a bit weird, right? Very simple, like, oh, you say you're a man, but you look like a woman. Okay, that's weird. The conservative would say, or the liberal would say, I think you're weird, but it seems like it avoids you a lot of pain to do this performance, right? So it causes you more pain not to do this performance than it causes me to witness it. So it's okay, right? You can do it. It matters more to you than it matters to me, right? So this is cool. While the conservative would say, you're weird and this is madness and you should stop it, right? That would be the difference between the two there. So they would go from this, well, individualist experience as a kind of basic building block here. And it tries to protect the individual and its enjoyment of what it wants against other interests, other political arguments, right? The interests of the community. Hey, you're doing this, but it's bad for children, or it causes weakness or whatever. You should join the army instead of pretending you wanna, like, you can't walk in high heels in the army. God damn it! And while are the values of the community, right? It's against God. We're gonna go to hell. Please stop this. Liberalism is about putting the individual above that. But it's not just that, right? So it starts from some basic self-interest. And of course, this sounds cute if I it's easily digestible because I use cultural arguments. But this goes a little bit different when we talk about economical ones, right? Oh, the individual wants to own a mine and destroy the environment. Oh, well, we should allow that. Oh, I found 9-year-olds who want to work in my factory. Well, if they want it, huh? So in economics, it gets a bit more serious, but I use cultural examples here. But liberalism is not just that. What liberalism does is it tries to reason from this individual interest to the general interest. That sounds logical, but that's different from other ideologies. Both conservatism and communism do the opposite. They start from a vision of a general interest. They start from what's good for society, and then they try to convince you that that's also good for you, right? That this is also in your interest. Liberalism goes the other way around. They start from some kind of selfish desire, and then they try to create a story about how this is good for society. So it has an opposite rhetorical flow to it than other ideologies do. It starts from what you want, and then it gives you an excuse to want that, rather than you understanding why something needs to happen. And how it does that, well, we'll see that in another slide. But it comes with some concern for equality, that liberals do care about the general interest. Because individualism, in an abstract way, assumes equality, in the sense that not economical equality, but if we're all individuals, then it makes no sense, for example, to judge you based on your background or based on some kind of group you belong to. It makes no sense to say you guys are born like this, like you're from a good family, therefore you should have more rights than people who are not, because you're all alone, like there are no groups. So you should be roughly equal, at least, right? Or you're equally rational, you're equally individual. So it assumes some type of equality, not economic equality, and not even necessarily political one, but at least on a philosophical level. So it does understand it needs to cater to many individuals, right? There must be some kind of general principle in it, not just the rich. And it does it, as we're going to see in the next slide, by assuming that this individualism, that everybody for themselves, has some kind of long-term benefit, that this is going to be good for society in the long run, that you have a stronger, more critical, for example, more innovative society, just to name some arguments. I'm not going to go into detail, but that you're going to get more competitive society if people follow their self-interest, right? But that's for the next slide. So briefly, what's the weakness here? Many, but the main one I want to point out is that this individualism, as I write it, black boxes social relations. What do I mean by that? A black box is a box that has the truth inside of it, right? What really happens in an airplane, but you can't see it. That's what a black box does. It hides it, it stores it, right? So if you black box something, you render invisible what's really going on. And this individualism, by assuming that you can judge things based on how an individual feels about it, if you make an individual choice, you're obscuring the social relations society. Society is a big web of interactions, right? Where everything affects everything. Things don't just happen to you. Every object you use is the end of some kind of production process. And if you throw it away, another one starts, right? If you talk about objects. But it goes with everything. Everything is some kind of social relation. So the question is, can you really talk about something as an individual choice? Let me give you the example of drugs. Not marijuana, which got legalized, because it's relatively harmless. But if you talk about heroin, for example, a consistent liberal argument should be that heroin use should be legal, right? And you could make the argument that, well, it brings pleasure to the individual, so it's good. And let's say that we are going to accept that we're not going to go onto some medical documentation of how it's going to ruin the individual, right? Let's assume that it's simply that's okay. That's your choice, your body, whatever. This is partly an illusion, because the choice to consume heroin is not just about you. By consuming heroin, you support and finance the Mexican drug cartels. Mexican drug cartels operate on extortion, murder, and slavery of people like you, people of your age that get kidnapped and that wake up on some farm in Guerrero, where you'll be pushing opium poppy for the rest of your life until you get raped and killed at 30. All of that is in the opium that heroin is made of, right? If people didn't consume heroin, there would be no cartels, our country would not be destabilized, and we would be a first world power. So, okay, that's maybe a bit of an overstatement, but you can see here that it's not that simple as to say, oh, I choose is my body. No, there's this long chains of consequences to choices people make, because we are in an interaction, in a big dance of society. So that's a bit tricky with liberalism, right? Now let's move on. Say of individualism. And individualism, as I said, needs to appeal to society as a whole. It needs to generalize the interest in the individual, to be an ideology, to be a political force. unless it wants to just be anarchism, which has never been successful, politically speaking, in the sense of convincing a lot of people. So it needs to come with some theory where individualism works for everybody. And that theory is going to be the harmony of interests. Liberalism cannot exist without assuming that there is some kind of harmony in society. That if individuals follow their self-interest, it will somehow, somewhere be okay. That if we all are selfish, that the outcome of that is going to be something that works, right? That if you look at it individually, it looks bad because people are being selfish. But if you zoom out far enough, you're going to see that them all pulling in different directions is actually going to bring it to the middle or something like that, right? That it's going to lead to some greater good. That ultimately this is compatible, and that the interest of the individual really is the interest of the group. And that you can see in everything they argue for, whether it's law or economics, etc. I'll give the economical example soon. But this is interesting because of how it interacts with other ideologies. So this is where you can see that liberalism fundamentally is on the right wing of the political spectrum. Because just like conservatism and nationalism, it assumes that there is some kind of basic justice or harmony in society. That while things are bad, in a larger sense, they're working for the better. That although we can criticize things, fundamentally life is fair in a very fundamental way. Right, in conservatism because, well, the elite rules and that's how it should be. In nationalism, because we live in this organic and it's natural. Liberalism also because it's natural or it's harmonious, right? But society fundamentally is good. And thus the hierarchy in society is good. Liberalism justifies a social order. It justifies inequality. Because the interest of the rich is the interest of the poor, right? If the rich get more money, they're going to spend more money, and you're going to catch some of that money if you dance for them, and that's good at the end of the day for everyone, right? If Elon Musk pays like taxes, he's going to be more creative, and it's going to be cool for you, and these type of things. And a lot of people believe this, right? We live in a liberal culture that worships the rich, because we think that what's good for them is good for us. But this is quite impressive, how liberalism, I'm not going to detail of any of the detailed arguments why they think this, because we saw them before. This is quite impressive what they're doing in assuming this general interest here. Because liberalism is the ideology of the capitalist class. That is a simple historical fact. Every liberal author of the classical era wrote their major books trying to defend some capitalist interest, starting from John Locke to all of them, Bentham, Mill, Ricardo, Smith, all of them were involved in some particular discussion, usually about taxes, and they then wrote a whole philosophical book just to make that tax cut, let's say, or just to get more power against the king or something like that. But it always was a very clear class interest of a capitalist elite that they had in mind when they wrote their books. But they were smart enough, brilliant enough, to always write this in a theory that talks about the whole of society. It's not like conservatism where it says the elite should rule because we're better than you. Screw you, damn it. That's not what liberalism does. Liberalism comes with a nice, appealing theory of why what's in the interest of the elite is really in your interest. It is patient. It explains things to people. So it tries to make this appeal to society as a whole, and is usually successful in that. So one example of this is Adam Smith's and Ricardo's and Mill's theory of prices, right? So in economical theory, if you take Adam Smith, for example, he would say one of the ways that there's a harmony of interest, there's many, but one of them is that if you have a free exchange, if you have free trade, if you have capitalism, one of the things that's going to do is everybody's going to work hard, and yes, the workers will get exploited, but that will create low prices. If you have low taxes and low wages, you can have low prices, and that means you can buy, your underwear for cheap. And that's where our interests coincide. It's in the interest of the capitalists to have low prices because they will sell more, but it's also in the interest of the middle class and lower class to have low prices because they can buy more, right? If you talk about food, that becomes very relevant to the survival of society. So through free trade, we get low prices, and even if everybody is selfish and trying to exploit each other, the end result of it is Walmart, right? And we all like Walmart. And you all want socialism until you have to pay $2 more for your Big Mac, right? Because you don't want to pay $2 more. Probably 17 cents, I think it was. Anyway, you don't want higher prices. So we are on the same page here. And there's many this type of arguments that they make. I'm not going to go through all of them. But this is kind of the rhetoric of it, right? This harmony that's assumed. Now, one of the weaknesses of this is that, well, in a very basic sense, it's just not true. At least it's not what happened in history. Liberalism had 400 years to create this harmony, and well, we're not there. I think most people would agree we're not exactly there. In its time, it created at least 3 different ideologies that fiercely disagreed with it, so there was no real harmony then in thought, right? Because it ignores that people are part of groups, right? There's a certain aggregate interest. You get inequality between groups because of this, different economical classes, and their interests are not the same. It is simply not true that the interest of the working class is the same as the capitalist class. At least that's not how the working class feels about it often. Sometimes it does, but there's been distinct moments in history when they clearly felt like this was not their interest. Now, with any of these criticisms I point out, it's important to understand that I'm not inventing this. I'm definitely not the first guy who sees this, right? Many liberals themselves were smart enough to see the weakness in their own theory. Ricardo, for example, Ricardo's the guy after Smith, my favorite of the classic liberals. He said there's 2 types of analysis. You have static analysis, that's what it means on paper. And on paper, this is great. We have harmony of interest. Then you have dynamic analysis. That's what's actually happening. What's actually happening is going terrible. But I'm a theorist, so I'm going to stick with the first, right? But so far in history, the theory is not working. We go to more disorganization in society, but it's going to work out, he says, because the theory will come through at the end. So he understands there's some discrepancy between the two. Right, but in general, it's optimistic, and that's a strength because people like optimism, and we need that sometimes. Third, we'll get to individual freedom. You can interrupt me, by the way, right, Mariana, if you're getting tired of me, if you want to break from my voice. Obviously, when you talk about liberalism, you have to talk about liberty. That's what the word means, right? That's what it's based on. So individual liberty, individual freedom, obviously is an important concept in liberalism. It's not actually the starting point. The starting point was this individualism and the kind of this raw class interest. The freedom part came later in history, that became important. It was first more about property than it was about freedom. But in this classical era, liberty becomes more important. You're going to read a text on this, right? 2 concepts of liberty. One of the more famous proponents, advocates of liberty, is John Stuart Mill. I don't know if you've heard of this man. He's the son of John Mill, who was also a philosopher, who forced his son to be a philosopher. It's interesting. And his son, John Stuart Mill, he wrote one of the more famous books within liberal tradition on liberty, which you can predict what it's about, in 1859. And here he makes the grand argument for freedom, which summarized in one sentence is that freedom should be the prime value in politics. Freedom is a political good in itself. It's good in itself because the goal of politics, as we saw with individualism, is the happiness of people. And the closest synonym to happiness would be freedom. Freedom is happiness to some extent, or to the freedom to be happy, whatever you want to call it. But freedom in itself is very close to happiness, and happiness is the ultimate measuring stick of things. Therefore, freedom is the superior value. Now, in order for something to be a value, it must have some kind of moral content too, right? And the moral content of liberty is that it creates a moral character. Liberty, by being free, by making choices, by being responsible, it creates moral character. It makes people better. It makes people smarter, more appreciative, and more mature. By being free, by allowing to make your own choices, you will mature because you will see the consequences of them. You will have a better appreciation of other people's freedom, and this freedom is going to create better people. That's his. It's a big gamble, right? But it's a nice sounding proposition that I like, actually. I like this idea because I use this same logic with cooperatives. If you remember my class on cooperatives, right? You can criticize, oh, but people are gonna do it wrong. They will make bad choices. You're never gonna get good at making choices without making choices, right? The more responsibility you're given, the more you will mature in making good choices. And well, I think that's true for companies, and I think that's just logically also true for individuals. So that would be the argument here. You create maturity from freedom. Conservatives deeply disagree on this, right? But and thus the question is, and how much freedom should we have? Mill is not an anarchist. He's not even a libertarian. He's a very reasonable guy, actually. So he says, from him comes this very sentence of my freedom starts where yours begins, or your freedom ends where mine begins, or this type of stuff, right? The idea is that people should be free unless it harms other people. This, of course, is a bottomless pit, because where exactly do you draw the line? Like, where do you start harming other people? And like, he tries to explain it, but he has no consistent rule. He just goes to a bunch of examples and explains you what he thinks, but he has no real guide for this, right? Because you can harm people in so many ways, as I've explained. You can even harm people emotionally by being bad to yourself, right? If you kill yourself, they're still going to harm other people because they'll be heartbroken about it. So it's hard to say what this exactly means. But that's, for philosophy, that's not a bad thing, because this creates discussion. It's a conversational piece. Where does freedom stop? And for liberalism, this discussion has been very productive. You have, that's where the different stances in liberalism come from, right? And you can take this very extreme, right? You can be dogmatic about liberty. And if you take it in an extreme, in a dogmatic form, where you say the only value in politics is liberty, typically I would argue against taking one value as absolute, right? And if you do that, you come in the more neoliberal libertarian part of it, where you will say, well, people can never be hindered unless they're stealing. But besides that, it's like the clear violation if you take my stuff. But besides that, the government should never intervene, right? The government should do nothing. regardless, healthcare, education, none of this is not important. But what's important is liberty. There's going to be opportunities, no rights for people, right? That's the extreme ends, but it's a spectrum, right? You also have a more utilitarian approach, which tries to see for the most freedom for the most people. And if you go for that, then, well, these liberals say, okay, these freedoms are going to conflict with each other, and we must govern them in some way. We must create the conditions in which people can be free together, right? Which is a never-ending work. So we need to try to organize this coexistence of freedoms. Maybe we should organize primary education, right, or something like that, or we should not allow child labor or something like that. And there's this a big debate within that, and that's where the different forms come from. But all of them value or see freedom as a good thing, as a supreme good, and they agree that it creates strong individuals and there's a stronger society, right? Society that's more self-critical because you have debate, you have innovation, you have things going wrong from which you then will learn, etc. The big weakness here, there's many, but again, the main one that I've explained in my other lecture on liberalism. My main problem with liberalism is that if you apply this dogmatically, you kind of give up on politics, right? Politics at the end of the day is about forcing people, right? Your neighbor is playing music very loud at 3 a.m. and your baby cannot sleep, and you call the police, and the police are going to ask him to turn his music down, right? If he refuses, they're going to beat him on the head with a stick. That's kind of what the police does. So politics on a very fundamental level is based on forcing people. And if you don't want to do that, then you can't do politics. You cannot solve problems. So this greatly limits the capacity. This very plain example is now with COVID, right? If you're not forcing people to follow the rules or get vaccinated, this will never end. Never will this end, right? As long as other people are free, I'll never be free. I'll never be able, with a young child, to just go out as long as nobody else follows the rules. So that's obvious that there's certain problems you're gonna run into with this. But this ideology makes the case that there's a lot of value in liberty. Next up, my voice is already getting destroyed. Next up, Diego, is constitutionalism, which is kind of a big general term. I immediately mean the rule of law here. So as I explained, I think another time, law is very important to liberals. Liberals think that you can organize society through rules, not to material composition, not to distribution, but to rules and enforcing those rules, right? The laws are very central to liberal theory, to any type of liberal. They usually have a legalistic way of thinking. It is the main way of protecting rights and property, right, and stopping the poor. It's through the law, it's through the police, it's through the court system. That needs to be very strong. So that's one form. I'm not going to explain this too much detail, but that's one form, because I've done it before, in which law is very relevant to liberalism because it protects. But they don't just mean law as a court system. They also mean law in a sense of a constitution. Constitutions are a liberal concept. They're technically older, but modern constitutions are liberal in the sense that a constitution is a law that is hard to change, right? That's kind of my basic definition of what a constitution is. It's the law that's beyond the law. It's a law that you cannot easily change to political force. It's a law that is there to explain what the law can do, that limits government, right? It's for some fundamental lines within which government has to operate. That's a liberal idea. You want to have a government, yes, because you need it to enforce things, but that government has internal restrictions. It has limits that are built into how it can function and what it can do. So liberals are obviously concerned with limiting the powers of the government. And this constitutionalism has a different flavor depending on how old it is. Because this typically starts out very progressive. Usually constitution is an improvement over the thing you had before it, right? That's why you make it. The Constitution of the French Revolution was super progressive for its time. The American Constitution was super progressive compared to what it came before that, which was slavery. So it's progressive, but the fact that you cannot change it makes it naturally age, right? The longer time goes on, the more conservative a constitution becomes, because it protects the power relations from 2 centuries ago in the present. So liberals, how conservative they are kind of depends on how old they are. The law, if they're like in Americans' case, if you take an orthodox liberal stance, you almost automatically become a conservative because you're defending a very old document that's kind of out of step with the present, right? So liberals over time shift towards the right and towards the more conservative way of thinking because they're defending the old in their constitutionalism. In the US, you can see it very clearly there because your constitutionalism, well, it becomes about protecting the established order, right, against change, against like the current government is trying to change the constitution and people oppose that. Through legal forms, to amparos, blah, 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 blah. Now, part of this need for a constitution comes from the need to protect individuals, to protect freedom, to protect individuality against the majority. This is something liberals are concerned with. They're scared of the masses, in a way, of the majority. Although they want to appeal to the majority, they also don't really trust people as a whole. They think that although the individual is good, together as a group, people might impose things on others, right? Which is not good for the individual. Whether it's from a communist, a socialist, a nationalist, or a conservative point of view, these majorities might do things that would limit the liberty of people. So they're against democracy in the Greek sense of democracy, or in the radical or direct sense. Democracy is the rule of the majority, plain and simple. Liberals are against this. They're against the rule of the mass. They're against direct democracy. Or as Aristotle put it, the rule of the poor, right? Because the majority might decide something. It might, for example, nationalize someone's property, right? For the greater good, to build a dam, for example. And well, liberals don't want that. So their relation to democracy is ambiguous. They are pro-democracy in a representation sense, as in they're against absolutism. They're against a king that just has all the power and never changes. They think people should, you should have political debate, you should have freedom of expression, you should have some type of vote as a form of freedom, right? But it should not be a direct vote on what happens. It should be a vote to punish the rulers. Like you could change the ruler. That's the point of your vote, but not to actually decide what's happening, because then you could override other individuals, and that's what they try to protect it from. And that's why you have all these checks and balances, and that's why they split the government into 3 powers, where the judicial one can endlessly stop like we have in Mexico, right? It just happened. They stopped the energy reform. You want all these ways to stop the majority from changing things away from what the Constitution was intended to do. Now, this protection of individuals has a very interesting effect in terms of political alliances, because liberals in history are often, let's say, a safe haven for all kind of weird minorities, all kind of sometimes very opposite minorities. For example, religious sects, or quasi like Mormons, things like that. They like liberalism because liberalism protects their weird ways, right? It protects their deviance from normal religion. So often ultra conservatives are going to be on the liberal side because that's the only side who will protect their particular practices, right? So these people, they will vote. They're not liberal. They agree with they disagree with everything in liberalism, but they will still vote for it because it will support a legal framework that allows them to do what they want to do, right? Same with other. So you'll have this weird coalition of both. I don't know. People want pedophilia to be legal and ultra conservatives who are gonna both flock to liberalism because they're those minorities. Okay, pedophilia case, no, that they would probably vote for that. But you get this interesting alliance here, and that is good in a way because it brings new blood into the liberal coalition. These religious minorities bring some other values into it, some kind of charity and values like that, which historically brings an interesting mix. For example, John Locke was a member of a very peculiar sect that like 14 people, but they, he was on the liberal side. He was a big liberal because he wanted his own religious freedom. That's interesting here. So it's a broader coalition than it might look at first sight. One weakness of constitutionalism is that it assumes that the state is the big enemy here, right? The state is the one that needs to be limited, which sociologically is naive to think that the state is the only form of domination in society. There are many things that dominate you and that dominate you more directly than the federal government does. The federal government doesn't, it levies taxes on you. It doesn't intervene with your life too much. Your boss intervenes with your life a lot. So I don't know, your family, whoever roof you live under, right? You have religion, you have a lot of other forces in the world, that is in the private or public sphere, that dominate people. So to think you can create freedom or protect individuals just by limiting the government is only part of the picture. Let's say it like that. And people might need the government to protect them from bigger threats to their freedom. So that's where constitutionalism sometimes, well, it's as the intention of protecting the individual, it might disempower it at the same time, because we might need to actually change some things in reality to keep people safe. So that's one limitation of this way of thinking. I thought I would be done in 5 minutes. Apparently I have a lot to say about this. Is this the last one? Is it? Yeah, okay. Lastly, when we talk about principles, let's talk about universalism. With some exceptions, most liberals have a universalist conception of politics. That means that they assume that people are the same, at least psychologically, that our minds work similarly, and that we're of the same race. And therefore, the same plan could apply to all people, right? The same liberal plan of liberal democracy, this very limited democracy, this is applicable anywhere at any time. And not only can it apply, it should apply. So liberals have this idea comparable to this like world communism of Trotsky on the right, on the left, that their ideology should be applied everywhere. And that's what's happening. So one famous idea of this is from Francis Fukuyama, American. His idea of the end of history, that after the defeat of communism, everybody would become liberal. That's what he thought would happen in the 90s. Because the same idea is possible anywhere, right? especially of later variants like neoliberalism, this is a very strong idea. It's for everyone. It's for the whole world. This is going to work. Nobody's left out, right? It's not true for the early liberals. The early liberals, like they were more universalist than their rivals, the conservatives at the time, but they didn't necessarily mean literally everyone, right? Locke had some exception for slaves. Mill thought that liberalism is great for Western people. The rest of the world are barbarians, so they should be ruled by colonialism, right? Consistency. So the early guys, because the money was on the side of their class, they would not necessarily extend this to everyone. But this is simply a mistake. These are just logical mistakes in their thinking, right? That's not necessarily liberalism's fault. It's their individual pettiness that leads them to believe this. It is logically consistent with the theory that this would apply to all humans. And later variants of liberalism do expand this to literally all humans. So it's universal, and it's also a bit ahistorical. Many liberals, our liberal theory always sounds like it has always been like this. Like they talk about like the natural state of people, or natural rights, or natural laws of economics. They have there's a rhetorical cadence to it that makes it look like history is just an accident, like it's the fault of some random bad people that we didn't have liberalism since the beginning. Because that's what, God made man and there was liberalism. Like that's how it was. And the fact that that's not true is because some evil people messed up the plan. But it should have always been like this, right? History is an accident. It's just some random things that happened. But really, the liberal theory was always true, right? And people wanted to live liberal, and if they could, they would naturally gravitate towards that. So this is of all times, is the idea. And you see this in the words they use. When they talk about natural rights, John Locke, this is metaphysical, right? The rights already existed. God made them, and we're just discovering them now. That's our ignorance that we didn't discover them earlier. They were always there, right? The same in economy. Liberal economists, they pretend like capitalism always existed. Like they talk about the law of supply and demand. But really, the system is 400 years old, right? There's no supply and demand in early medieval times. So, but they were wholly convinced that this is kind of just how humanity works, right? Same with reason, etc. Which puts them at odds with other ideologies, right? Conservatives obviously think history matters because they're trying to protect it. They're looking backwards, looking towards the past. Nationalists don't agree with universalism. They think each country is different and cultures are different and they matter. Cultures are not just random. Cultures are not just some kind of random collection of mistakes and neurotics that particular people have, that if time passes, everybody would come to this liberal culture. At least that's what nationalists say. And for communists, this is obvious blasphemy, because history is very meaningful. History is not accidental. History is a series of disasters that intentionally put one class in dominance over the other, right? History is intentional in the communist worldview, and it needs correction. And there's a dialectic to it. Liberals kind of assume an eternal present in a way. They know that's not literally true, but they kind of explain that away. And the big appeal of this, again, is that it's for everyone. Anybody in the world could feel attracted to liberalism because it's open to them. There's no inherent person that it's targeting. The weakness, of course, is that it's blind to history, right? History is real. Things were different in different stages, and it's a bit cruel. I think it's cruel to ignore this. It's cruel to assume that we're equal when we're not. Like if you take a practical example of vaccines right now, you could say, well, free market, everybody can buy vaccines. You all have the opportunity. Well, no. If you're Burkina Faso, yeah, I have the opportunity to buy it, but I can't pay more than the Americans, right? For historical reasons, I'm poorer than them. And so this is just cruel to pretend that we're equal, because we're not. His history was not fair. It's like you start Monopoly with one person having half the money, and you say, well, the rules are the same for everyone. That's true. Yeah, the same dice, and it's going to be equal, but it's not, because that's not historically the starting positions. Again, liberals, some understand this and are going to try to correct this. They're self-critical enough to see their own flaws. Now, let's end on appreciating liberalism, right? So, oh wait, let me first take questions, because my last slides are not that important. Related to use interviews in other countries. That's for many reasons. Some are nationalist, some are conservative. But there is this idea in the US that the whole world should have their system and that they want it. Even if they say, like, we don't want it, they're like, but you really do. So they'll come and liberate you from your misunderstanding and your backwardsness, and bring democracy to Iraq. Do you have any questions before I go to this last slide?
I have one, but I'm not sure if it's like it's more a general one.
Okay.
I often hear liberals saying that the way to destroy inequality is by educating people through education. And like, is there any consistent argument for that idea? Because, for example, I can say that the way to reduce inequality is by redistribution, not by education. But is there any consistent arguments for liberals for saying that?
The idea behind that is twofold, right? It's that people who are educated will make better choices, and therefore they will get out of poverty. Here, the underlying assumption, of course, is that you're in poverty because you make bad choices, right? They don't say that, but that's below the water. And the other one is that the assumption in liberalism is that the market generates opportunities for everyone. And education will help you take those opportunities. And there is a simple truth in it that, especially in countries like US, higher educated people do earn more, right? In Europe, it's slightly different. It's not necessarily true in our case, in Belgium's case, but in most, well, we're not a liberal country. In most liberal countries, it's true that with higher education, you earn more. So I think that's the main argument there.
Okay, I got it. And also, like you just said that it's like playing Monopoly, no? Like you have all the money, you have the half of the money, and I have nothing. When people say that we should have the same opportunities, like we should all start from the same level, what they truly want to say, oh, what they are assuming is communism, like, because I also hear many people saying that liberalism is good, capitalism is good, but we should start and have the same conditions. But under liberalism, it's impossible to still have the same possibilities at the same
Well,
conditions, or it's not?
if you go far down that line, you say you end more in socialism. Socialism is an ideology who tries to do that, right? Who consistently tries to do that to not have fair opportunities, but have fair chances. There's a difference to having the same opportunity and having the same chance at something, right? Um, if to win, and if you're playing dice, right, and you need to roll 2 or up to win, and I need to roll 12 to win with 2 dice, we both have an opportunity to win, but we don't have the same chances, right? So you end towards a very social liberalist, almost socialist variant of liberalism, who tries to do that. I forgot what your question was. I just started explaining something. What was your question?
Uh, I forgot it because I feel that you resolved like, my question, but it was just
Oh,
that.
okay. Well, I'll take it.
Yes, it's okay. Don't worry.
Well, so you have a variant of liberalism who understands this problem and will try to do things to offset that.
Also, I have another question. Sorry.
It's good.
In individual freedom, I believe you said that one of the weakness is well, I didn't understand the the weakness like about forcing people.
Sorry, what?
In the third principle, the individual freedom, there was a weakness, and I didn't understand it. Like limits capacity to stop collective
Yes,
problems, but
if
you give an example that like police force you to not doing something or something like
no,
that.
what I mean with this is that if you don't want to interfere with people's freedom, you cannot you cannot organize coordination. You cannot make people go in the same direction. If you cannot make people go in the same direction, you cannot solve problems that people cause. Um, you cannot solve climate change. You cannot solve COVID. You cannot solve inequality. You cannot solve anything that people. If our self-interest does lead to some problem, right? There's no way of staving people away from that if you keep respecting their freedom. In many times in history, the leader needs to slap some people around and make something happen, right? If you refuse to do that, you're throwing the dice. You're just hoping things will be okay, but you can't do that. And that's, I think, but that's my vision on it. I think this would make liberalism extremely dangerous in our times, because we live in a time where you have massive problems like migration, but also like robotization, for example. If you just let things happen, I believe this will lead to some disaster. And so if you don't want to intervene with it, you become very powerless as a society. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And when we talk about freedom, should we also understand it like freedom of speech, right?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, got it. Thanks.
That's how you should. That's the type of freedom you should think about first. Historically, liberals are about protecting the individual in things like privacy, freedom of speech, um, freedom of association, freedom of partnership. These are very liberal things. So it's not just, yes, it's economic freedom, and that's what it became under neoliberalism. They start stressing that a lot. But originally, it's other kind of more civil freedoms, like human rights type of freedoms that we're talking about. So to wrap it up, right? My point of this lecture is that I want you to understand that while liberalism is the default option, it's the normal, it truly is an ideology, and you should see it like that, as in that ideologies are worldviews that put up a narrative to justify the interests of a certain group, right? Communism comes with some story why the interests of the working class deserve priority, for example. But the same is true of liberalism. Liberalism is an upper class ideology that draws on a lot of narrative assumptions about harmony, about the individual, about freedom, and that combine these two into some kind of political program that appeals to everyone, right? But it is a construct. It is not normal. It is normal to us, but there's clear alternatives to it. And it leads to a rather optimistic ideology with a lot of blind spots, right? Because its assumptions are not necessarily the strongest. But despite that general critical stance, there's a lot to appreciate in liberalism. First of all, it definitely works in the sense that it's successful. It did become dominant for reasons, right? It did reinvent itself for reasons. It's not weak in that sense. Part of its strength comes from its thinkers, especially if you compare this to conservatives. Liberalism just had a lot of brilliant minds on their side over time. There's a strong intellectual tradition that you could even argue comes from liberalism itself, in the sense that if you have free speech and free debate, you're going to have more discussion, therefore better intellectuals, right? And often fair intellectuals, as in they understand the strengths of somebody else's argument and they'll actually listen to it. And liberals in general are pleasant people to talk with, because they're generally fair in how they argue. Other strength of it is just that there's some kind of timeless appeal in this appeal to individual pleasure, this appeal to freedom, this appeal to law and rights. They might not be wrong on how human nature is, but they're definitely right that something in human nature appeals to this. Not the other way around, that this appeals to something in human nature, and that's what makes it always come back. That, and that it serves the elite interest, and has a kind of endless money behind it, makes it always come back. There's always something that people, even if it just collapsed, somebody's gonna be, but what if we try this? There's something inspiring in it. And liberalism is flexible, which is a bit different. It's flexible in the sense that it can actually change the theory. Conservatism is flexible in the sense that it can make alliances. Conservatism is flexible in the sense that it will hitch a ride on the back of some other political movement, right? You have conservative liberals, you have conservative nationalists, conservative socialists, like the Partido Encuentro Social, right? They literally hitch rides of other political parties to get into power. Liberalism doesn't do that. It's flexible in the sense that it can actually change itself, right? Not just sell out to other things, but it over time it has proven it can find new things to apply itself to, new issues. First it was against the king, then against limitation of the market, then it kind of morphed into the social liberalism. Nowadays it politicizes things like gender and identity, and it always finds a way, this time in its woke pink sense, it finds a way of reinventing itself and becoming relevant again, which some other ideologies struggle with more, or take a longer time to do, and that's just the great strength of it. And it helps us also see the weaknesses of other ideologies, right? It points out, it always pays attention to how individuals are doing under a certain system. It calls attention to minorities. It always reminds us of the dangers of there being no checks on power, right? This whole constitutional idea. If you did have constitutions in, let's say, communist China, or if they were applied, things would have gotten better. Communism would have been saved from some of its horrors. if it had a little bit of liberalism in it. And this liberal perspective does offer an enrichment, I think, of other ideologies. If you apply its critiques to them, I think you would have better variants of the others. And it's been very productive. Liberalism interacts well with others. It is often open to criticism. It will absorb elements of them. It absorbed a large part of socialism to become or to stay relevant, right? And it generates other ideologies. The other ones were born from this. Liberalism failed, and then there was a reaction to that. And that's where the others come from. That's where communism comes from. That's where socialism, conservatism come from. So it is, at least, it is productive, which is a compliment liberals would like, I think, to be productive. So that is my appreciation of liberalism. There. I'm done talking, people. Do you have more things to say, though? Hugo, Diego.
I have a question.
Okay.
I think it could be a silly question, but I don't know. Is it correct if you say like someone is liberal, both liberal and neoliberal, or while you say in these times neoliberal, it naturally includes both? But because I understand that they are different things.
No, you could be the same. For example, Joe Biden is kind of both. The qualifying thing for neoliberalism, at the end of the day, is if you push capital. If you do things that are in the interest of the richest people, you are on the neoliberal side, right? Free trade, etc. Joe Biden is that. He is backed by Amazon, right? By the richest people in the world are on his side, not the Republican side. So he's neoliberal in the sense that he will represent the big banks or the elites, but he is liberal in the sense of caring for minorities and the identity thing, and also, well, he's not against regulation, right? He thinks there should be some social programs, and he's for a minimum wage and these kind of things. So he has a liberal. He's more liberal than neoliberal in that sense, but he does. I think in that case, and the American Democrats are in between those two things. I hope that makes some sense.
Yes, it makes. And I also think that it's quite problematic if you are both, because liberalism, as we saw before, will say, okay, we gotta have free market in order to every individual have the freedom to choose whether to buy, what to buy, etc. But neoliberalism creates these oligopolies or monopolies in the market, and we don't have like much diversity when we choose, for example, our telephone company, or I don't know, the the bimbo food.
Yes. Well, um, yeah, well, we'll discuss neoliberalism soon. Neoliberal answer to that is that we need more free market. It's not a problem, it's a solution. Diego, you're too narrow-minded, the neoliberal would say. There's no problems, only opportunities. Okay, I have to go, and so do you. So I'll see you guys and girls Thursday. All right?
Thank
Take
you.
care.
See you.
Goodbye. Have a nice day.
Bye.